Well, Governor Tim Walz appears to be preparing for a third term as Minnesota's governor. The election, which will occur in 2026, will be a test for Tim Walz and his appeal to Minnesota voters after his disastrous, and I mean disastrous, run as vice president in 2024 with Kamala Harris, and will really be testing the waters for a possible 2028 run for the presidency. Now, for the governor's race, he will be favored in the general election right out of the gates. There's no doubt about that if he decides to jump in this race, and could make history, as no governor has been elected to a third term in Minnesota since they constitutionally allowed governors to run for more than 2 terms back in the 60s. And hopefully, we can make sure that Tim Walz doesn't get a third term, but we're going to jump into all of that for you today. So let's jump into it. Starting with Tim Walz. We know Tim initially elected back in 2018 by about 11.5 points over Jeff Johnson, who I believe he was on the Hennepin County Board of Commissioners and was a member of the Minnesota House of Representatives for about 6 years, I believe. So initially elected back in 2018, he was replacing then incumbent Governor Mark Dayton. And this was a pretty safe victory for Democrats. And you can say that the overall national tide was for the Democrats. Things were shifting towards the Democrats away from President Trump and his administration. We saw in 2018, Republicans, although they did pick up a seat in the Senate, they lost roughly 40 seats in the House. You saw a lot of governorships across the country shift towards the Democrat Party. You saw New Mexico, Nevada, Kansas, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Look at Maine. They all flipped their governorships from the Republican Party from that election back in 2014, when you had huge victories in these different elections. But fast forward to 2018, and it's a different story. The Republicans were the party in power. We know, historically, the party in power does not do great in that midterms. It just does not go good. And we know in Minnesota that Tim Walz, he is running for a third term, and no governor has ever served 3 terms in Minnesota. And it is expected that he will announce sometime this summer if he's going to be running or not. Now, Minnesota, there's a lot kind of going on in Minnesota. You have an open Senate seat with Tina Smith. She decided she's not going to run. There's kind of been a jump into the primary. Most of the support seems to be coalescing behind Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan, but it really showed that there was a pretty big disconnect between Tim Walz and his Lieutenant Governor, Peggy Flanagan. So he will have to pick a new Lieutenant Governor to run with in 2026 if he decides to run. Because we know Peggy Flanagan, after Tina Smith announced that she would not be running for re-election, came out within hours announcing that she would be running for this seat, really leapfrogging Tim Walz, which he was very much expected to run for that Senate race if Tina Smith did not run for re-election. And we know there's been a lot of in-party fighting with the Democrats in Minnesota, especially when Tim Walz was out on the campaign trail with Kamala Harris. Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan was doing a lot of things using campaign funds that Tim Walz wasn't very appreciative of, let's just put it that way. He was not very thrilled that these things were happening behind the scenes when he was not there. So there's a very interesting dynamic that we're going to see. So that could make a Democrat primary less competitive, just due to the fact that there are 2 statewide offices that are open. There is no incumbent in those races, which is going to really reduce the competition in each race, but it could still be competitive in each race. It seems like a lot of people have more interest in the Senate race than they do the governor's race as of right now. But like we said, Tim Walz, we will know sometime this summer, it's expected. And if he doesn't run, I 100% expect Angie Craig, the representative from Minnesota's 2nd Congressional District, to run. She is basically Tim Walz's hand-picked replacement, whether it was for the Senate, whether it was for the governor's race. She is his hand-picked successor, basically. And like we said, this could be a big test for Tim Walz moving forward. He has his eyes set, and he's made a lot of announcements about that he has his eyes set on 2028. He wants to run in 2028. There is no doubt about it. Even though he says, hey, I don't really want to. I'll only do it if there's a fallen. He does. We all know it. Right now, he's on this nationwide tour going to congressional districts where there are Republicans who could be vulnerable in 2026 in the midterms. He's going around campaigning in these districts, holding rallies. Now, obviously, not pulling anywhere near the crowds that Bernie Sanders or AOC are in the Fight the Oligarchy rallies, but ultimately, he is going around, and there are a lot of local Democrat chapters that are willing to embrace a loser, which is fair because he lost the vice presidency. He did. Look at 2026 or 2024. They lost every single swing state. Every single swing state the Democrats lost. Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, North Carolina. They lost every single swing state. And it is very, very fair to say that Pennsylvania's Governor Josh Shapiro really could have helped Kamala Harris. But like I've talked about in many other videos, I think Josh Shapiro was the pick to be nominee, and he turned it down. He said, hell no. He said, get away from me. Your toxic loser brand of identity politics doesn't fare well in my state, so get out. And hopefully everything's good with Josh Shapiro, because apparently there was just some news this morning that an arson apparently started a fire at the governor's mansion in Pennsylvania. So we all hope that he is doing okay. But if Tim Walz decides to run in 2026 for this race, it really could restrict him in 2028. We know, we've seen it time and time again. There are incumbents who are deciding they are not going to run. Look at Gretchen Whitmer. Look at Gavin Newsom. Now, granted, they're term limited, but there were other races that could be competitive that they could have jumped in. Gretchen Whitmer, you could have looked towards the Senate. But no, she understands that if she wants to run in 2028, or if that Tim Walz wants to run in 2028, you are restricted a lot by the duties that you have to take care of as governor, or as a senator, or as an elected official. You have a lot of duties that will hold back your ability to campaign properly. Look at Newsom, look at Whitmer, look at Buttigieg. They're all lining up for this. And even Kamala Harris, she's considering running for the governor's race in California. That could restrict her as well. We talked about that. But we know in the 2026 election, there's going to be a lot of issues that are nationally focused and a lot of issues that are state focused. Some of the top issues, of course, are going to be holdovers from the last election. Inflation, affordability, and really the country's temperature when it comes to the Trump administration. But there are also going to be a lot of specific issues. Accountability for feeding our futures. Who knew what? Why is it coming out that Governor Walz may have known what was going on with feeding our futures, but they were still sending millions of dollars to this nonprofit? Same thing with Attorney General Keith Ellison. What did he know? What did Secretary of State Steve Simon know? What did they know? That could hurt Democrats in the state. You look at the budget deficit. We went from having a $17 billion budget surplus in the state. And you know what they did? They increased funding for social programs, free meals in all the schools, their DEI and woke policies in schools. That they are pushing that using these extremely, extremely liberal social programs that they use that budget surplus to pay for, which now we're projected to have a pretty large deficit in 2028, which that could have a very big effect on the race, but I think it could have a bigger effect maybe later down the road if this isn't solved, if there still is a large budget deficit. But you also look at tax increases. Governor Walz wants to increase taxes. We have some of the highest state taxes in the country, and he wants to continue to increase taxes. They want to increase the gas tax. They want to increase property taxes. Now, granted, that's done at the county level, but there's a lot that the state government has to do with property taxes and why these counties need to raise more money. They've given all these monies to different school districts, but now that the federal funding from COVID has dried up, there's all these social programs that these districts are required to maintain, but yet there is no funding from the state or the federal government to take care of it. But we could also see, when it comes to the woke DEI policies that we're seeing in schools. We saw what happened in Virginia in 2021 with Glenn Youngkin, the parental rights. Obviously, I think we didn't have a great candidate in 2022 in Scott Jensen. I like Scott Jensen, and I voted for Scott Jensen. But ultimately, do I think he was the strongest person to be in that race? No. I think there are other, how would you say this? There were other nominees that I would have been okay with, that I would have rather, Kendall Quayles would have much rather seen him in that race. Look at someone like a Pete Stauber or even a Tim Pawlenty. I know Tim Pawlenty tried to run in 2018 and didn't go so well for him, but I would have liked to see a more moderate Republican, America First Republican, but a little more moderate that has good, as popular in the state of Minnesota, but his electability is also good in the state. But we also could see what are the effects of the crime policies. We know the decriminalization of so many misdemeanors and felonies in the Twin Cities has been huge. Crime is out of control in the Twin Cities. That could definitely have a big effect on this. And then, of course, the urban and rural divide. There's always the priorities of people who live in urban areas versus rural areas. That is always, it's like you can see it here. You can look at this race right here. Even looking at presidential elections going back, you can look at this in Minnesota. It's very clear that there is a rural and urban, the big city is Duluth, and then the Twin Cities. Go back all these years. Look at this. You have Democrats winning in very, very rural areas. Go back even further than that. Look at this. 1996, they won all but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 counties. They won all but 10 counties. And Bob Doyle still didn't blow it out of the water in any of these. But now we can see that a lot of these counties are Republican Trump strongholds. In this field, if Walz decides not to run for re-election, I do expect this field to get crowded. Not as crowded as it may be, but I do expect more people to jump in here. Like I said, Angie Craig, definitely expect her to jump in this race. Some other names that you could expect that I could expect, maybe people like Steve Simon, people like Keith Ellison, maybe Al Franken, Ilhan Omar. Now, Ilhan Omar did come out and said that she's going to pass on the Senate race, and she's going to run for re-election. But if the governor's race is open, maybe that's something that she decides to come back and take a second look at. Maybe Kelly Morrison, who is the newly elected representative from Minnesota's 3rd Congressional District. So Melissa Hortman, there's a lot of different names that are being thrown out here that I think if Tim Walz indicates, there's not a lot that you can see right now, but I think if Tim Walz indicates that that's not the direction, he is not going to run for re-election, you are going to see this get a lot more crowded than it currently is. But like we said, we talked about with the Senate, it could be less competitive just because we have 2 statewide races that you could see here. And this primary could really show how the Democrat base wants to approach Trump and combat him. The same thing with the Senate race. You are going to see, based on who the nominee is, what is their approach to the Trump administration? Are they more of in the kind of Chuck Schumer camp where we're going to do everything we can to not to stop Donald Trump, but when we feel like there is something that could politically be poison to us, we're going to step in and do the right thing, versus, people like AOC, Ilhan Omar, the more left wing of the party, and I would say about 70% of the party that wants the Democrat leadership and Democrat politicians to fight Trump at every turn, regardless if the policies that Trump is promoting are supported by the Democrats, whether it is, these are 80-20 issues that Trump is choosing the 80 side of, and the Democrats are then going to choose the 20 side. We can see that Democrats, they want to fight Trump at every turn, regardless of what's going on. But like we said, it's going to show a lot. How is this going to be approached? How will this be approached by the Democrat base? And we can see right now that the general predictions show that this is going to be a likely or solid Democrat hold, which I think as of right now, I could say I agree. I think the Senate race is much more up in arms, but also I think a lot is going to depend on what happens with Tim Walz. Will he run? Now, as far as the Republican primary, that kind of, there's a lot of other, how would you say this, names that could be thrown out here. Right now, Jeff Johnson, who is a former city council member, and to not be confused with the Jeff Johnson that ran in 2018 against Tim Walz. You also have Phil Parrish, who is well known in conservative circles in Minnesota. He's a teacher and was previously a candidate, I believe, in either 22 and 2018. We're going to see what happens. You have people like David Hahn, who's the former chair of the Minnesota Republican Party, Mike Lindell, the CEO of MyPillow, and a pretty big advisor to Donald Trump, had a lot to say about election denialism in 2020. You look at Scott Jensen, who he was the nominee in 22, Kendall Quayles, who was Minnesota's 3rd Congressional District nominee in 2020 and a candidate for governor in 22. I think, if I'm looking at the Republican primary here, who am I looking towards? I hate to say it and throw it out there again, but Tim Pawlenty, and I know he doesn't want to run for this, but Tim Pawlenty, he was the last Republican to win a statewide election here. People like Jim Schultz or Kendall Quayles could be big names. I think Mike Lindell, you could get a lot of outside fundraising from Mike Lindell, but I think someone like Jim Schultz or Kendall Quayles would be a great pick, or even a Ryan, gosh, what was his name? He was the nominee for state auditor in 2022. But Jim Schultz and gosh, and now I'm gonna need to look this up. 2022 let's see, his name was Ryan Wilson. He ran the closest election in the 2020 statewide election for the Republicans, along with Jim Schultz. They ran some of the closest elections. So I think that could be a positive for the Republican Party if they go the Jim Schultz, Kendall Quayles, Ryan Wilson route. I think Pete Stauber, Tom Emmer, stay where you're at. we need Republicans in the House right now. There's no doubt about that. But like we said, at the end of the day, with Tim Walz in this race, it still is a likely or solid Democrat seat as of right now. Now, just like every other state, this race is going to come down to a couple things. And logistically, it comes down to how well can the Democrats run up the vote total in Hennepin County, in Ramsey County, in Dakota County, in Washington County. How well can they run it up in places like St. Louis County? And less up here. There's not a lot of people up here, but they're just very liberal up here. But, you know, looking down in the cities here, how large can that vote total get to? Can it outdo all of really the Republican, more conservative counties, the rural versus urban divide? Can they run up the margin in the Twin Cities to combat the huge GOP support from rural Minnesota? And, you know, you look at years past, you know, look at Hennepin. That's the big one. Hennepin and Ramsey County, those are the two big. It's like obviously Hennepin's the biggest. But look at this. Hennepin up by 42 points. Hennepin, 43 points. Hennepin by 34 points. It's like, you know, when you saw Trump within a point versus Clinton in 2020 or 2016, you saw Hennepin County a lot closer to 34. So it's like if you're going to see a Republican winning in the state, you need to drive up low propensity voters. That's just a must. And without Donald Trump on the ballot, that's going to be hard. You need to really blunt the amount of Democrat turnout that you have in Hennepin County. You need to see support for the Democrats roughly in the high 20s to low 30s area if you want a Republican to win. It is just as simple as that. You really need to cut down on that margin in order to win this race. Now, ultimately, there's a lot that still needs to unfold here. We have a lot that we're going to see unfold in this race. Will Tim Walz jump in? Who on the Republican side will jump in? There's a lot to play out here. How will the budget turn out? How are the issues at the national level going to play out? How inflation, the Trump administration, tariffs, Trump's domestic agenda, his domestic spending agenda, tax cuts. How is that able to play out? We got a lot to see. We are going to be here every step of the way, bring you the news, tell you what's going on, let you know what is going on in this race. So that's going to wrap things up for today, folks. I'd really appreciate it if you drop down below, hit that subscribe button. That really helps us reach more and more people every single day. So I appreciate you guys and have a great rest of your day.